Hey people, Shinobi no Kami here. In this fanfic, due to a quirk of fate, Naruto passes the academy graduation exam on his first try. Because of this, his life takes an interesting turn before he joins Team 7 after Kakashi poaches him from his sensei. How will this affect the timeline? Before we begin, please like, share, and subscribe if you enjoy. Tell me your thoughts in the comments section. So without any further ado, let's roll the intro. Chapter 36, Training and Awakening. Naruto had been going over the finer points of his plan for dealing with his first match during the third phase of the exams with Tetsuo-sensei, namely, don't let Neji get close enough to touch him, and use things that don't require chakra if he does. When the white-haired pervert that Tetsuo-sensei had informed him was named Jiraiya and was apparently one of a group of 3 legendary ninja who had trained under the old man Hokage before the Second War showed up. "What are you doing here?" he asked, as he looked up from the information he and Tetsuo-sensei had managed to get on the Juken, in order to better form their strategy. "I had a little spare time, and thought I'd drop by and teach you how to summon toads," Jiraiya said, going into some over-the-top pose as he did so. What was it with ninja and drama? It was like they were deliberately trying to be contrary or something. You're told all through the academy that a ninja was not meant to be noticed and that there should be almost no sign of your passing, and just as soon as you graduate, and before then even. Well, there was Zabuza and his flying sword trick, the exam proctors and their suddenly appearing in a cloud of smoke due to several simultaneous shunshuns. There was Enko flying in through a window and flinging a banner, there was Meta Guy's dynamic entry, and there was this guy. Sure, a dramatic entrance could knock an enemy off balance and cause them to over or underestimate you depending on the situation, but it was also a good way to get yourself killed, since you've just pulled yourself away from any available cover and completely ruined the element of surprise. "Great," he said semi-excitedly once he'd finished internally grumbling about ninja and unnecessary drama. It seemed that the pervert he finally remembered to have been the one who had ogled Suzume in the mixed baths that one time was actually holding to his word. That didn't mean that he wasn't going to prank him for upsetting Suzume though. He'd be taking care of that just as soon as the man finished teaching him how to summon toads. Toad summoning would actually be useful for his fight during the third phase of the exams, as he could use the creatures as some sort of distraction while he set his traps and goaded the Hyuga bastard into them. Neji would probably shit himself if he found himself facing a monster toad the size of the one that the Yondaime had ridden into battle against the Kyuubi. There was a picture of the thing in one of the history books he'd found in the library, and if he found himself looking up at one of those, he'd want to run himself. Since he wasn't the Yondaime, chances were that he'd only manage get some sort of medium-sized toad however, but a few of those would be rather useful. For the next few hours, while Tetsuo-sensei stood aside and watched, the pervert went over the basics of toad summoning. Several miles away from Naruto and his toad summoning lesson, Sasuke growled at his teacher. It was the closest he had come to speaking to the man over the last 4 days. That day, like every other day, the man had woken him up at an insanely early hour, ran him through a training routine from hell, and yet he expected more out of him. "You know, that attitude problem of yours is the reason you didn't graduate early like Naruto did," Kakashi said, casually leaning against a tree with his nose buried in his perverted book as he had been doing for the last hour. "What?" he yelled, stunned by Kakashi's little revelation. "Your attitude and apparent superiority complex which you seem to have inherited from your father was seen as potentially disruptive," Kakashi said calmly as he turned a page. "The fact that an early graduation would have placed you on a team with older genin would have been disruptive enough," Kakashi continued, still reading that book. "The addition of your rather atrocious attitude would almost certainly have sparked a number of power struggles within your team as the older genin tried to maintain a dominant position, which would have resulted in a great deal of infighting, which would have had catastrophic effects on any mission such a team would be assigned to, as has happened with similar teams before. It was decided that unless your attitude improved, you would remain with your initial graduating class, since the members of that class would be able to compensate for and work around your behavior since they were already accustomed to dealing with it. Over the following years, your attitude got worse instead of better, and here we are, with you causing trouble as predicted. Kakashi casually concluded as he turned another page. After listening to the Hitaki's listing of his failings, he sat there stunned. The only reason he hadn't graduated with that boy, or possibly even before him as he should have, was because somebody thought he had an attitude problem. An attitude problem. Well now, 10 more laps, and try to improve your time, as this is an exercise for increasing speed as well as stamina. If you're going to knock off guys' students' routine like you tried to do during our spar yesterday, you'll need both. Kakashi said lazily, gesturing toward the track he'd worn into the grass over the last couple of days. Over in the Hyuga compound, Neji continued his solitary training, ignoring the strangeness of the last few days. Instead of the usual reverent treatment he got from the other branch house members and the words of encouragement that accompanied it, everyone seemed to be dodging him, as if they didn't want to be associated with him for some strange reason. It was probably because they thought that he would be up for punishment for what he had done to that loser Hinata during the preliminaries. While there was an awful lot of bad blood between the main and branch houses, there was no outright conflict besides the occasional argument. The reason for this was simple: the main house held the lives of all of the branch house members in their hands. As children, each branch house member was marked with a seal which could seriously hurt or even kill them when activated by a member of the main house. He'd learned about the pain the hard way early on when his uncle had activated his seal for merely looking at Hinata the wrong way several years ago. It still felt strange, however, to receive fearful glances from his branch house relatives as his family skirted him in the halls instead of approaching him and asking him how he was doing or how his training was going, or providing words of encouragement in regards to his future performance in the third phase of the exams. Oh well, such was fate, and if it was his fate to be shunned, then so be it. Gaara smiled faintly when the man named Kyuki welcomed him with a smile and handed him his usual. Over the last couple of weeks, he'd apparently become a regular enough customer that the man already remembered his preferred order the instant he saw him. As always, the food wasn't the best, but the company was to die for. When he was halfway finished with his meal, a brown-haired Chunin with a scar across his nose sat down next to him. After giving him the usual initial once-over that he got from all shinobi who weren't native to Suna, the man simply went on with his life without showing any fear beyond the small amount of caution one gives a foreign stranger. It was unusual to him since the expressions he got at home were of varying degrees of terror, and the ones he got when he encountered foreign shinobi during a mission usually swiftly morphed into the same. He wasn't used to it being otherwise, and he didn't like the feeling of being ignored like this, the feeling that his existence didn't matter one way or another to the person who was sitting next to him. He could feel his anger rising as the man continued to ignore him, but before it could get to the point where he would actually kill the man and quite possibly ruin some plans that had been in the works for months, something distracted him. "Hey, Gaara, was it? How's it going?" A familiar voice called out as a certain blonde moved to sit next to the Chunin, and a brown-haired man of average height with dark eyes that looked to be a Junin sat next to the blonde. "Okay," he finally replied. "Good." The blonde, who seemed to have been somewhat aptly named after a ramen topping considering how much of the stuff he ate, said before greeting the scarred Chunin who was apparently Ruruka's sensei, and answering the two men's questions about how he and Gaara met. Instead of leaving him out of the conversation with the two men whom Naruto knew well, Naruto had tried to include him in it. As he sat there eating, he wasn't being ignored as he almost had been before Naruto had arrived, and he wasn't being looked at with a challenging expression the way many had looked at him before they realized his true strength, or with the expressions of abject terror that his fellow villagers usually bore when they encountered him. Instead, he was being treated as an acquaintance, and it was odd, and he wasn't exactly sure how he felt about it. After several hours of training, Sakura flopped to the ground gasping for breath. She had known all of the basics from the academy, and thought she was good, but Ebisu was on a whole nother level. This man had taken the academy basics and turned them into an art. Not only that, but the man had a bunch of other tricks up his sleeve she'd never even imagined, and he intended on teaching her a number of them over the coming month. She could see why the man was considered to be an elite tutor, and she felt honored to be learning from him. "We'll work on that genjutsu exercise Kurenai-san demonstrated yesterday," the man said after she had rested a while and gotten her breath back. "Yes, Ebisu-sensei," Sakura said, standing despite the fact that she was exhausted. She was going to do everything in her power to prove to the man that she wasn't wasting the time he had devoted to her when he could be doing other more important things. She was going to grow stronger, and pass the third phase of the exams, and show all of the people who had taken the time to teach her that their time hadn't been wasted. Over on one of the training grounds, Lee kicked his practice stump for the 600th time. He was training harder than usual for the third phase in the exams. He was going to be up against a puppet user during the first match, which meant that he was practically going to get 2 opponents instead of 1 right off the bat. And, if he defeated the puppet user, he would get a chance to fight Neji and show everyone what a genius of hard work could do against a true genius during the second round. He would have to train really hard in order to be his best for that day. Fortunately, since Neji had wandered off to train on his own somewhere, Gai-sensei was there to help him every step of the way. "Good work, Lee," Gai-sensei said as he continued his warm-up, shifting to his other leg. "Thanks, Gai-sensei," he replied as he started counting kicks for his left leg. He didn't know what he would have done if Gai-sensei hadn't been there for him since before he'd graduated the academy. Probably dropped out of the ninja program altogether, believing that his academy nickname of hot-blooded loser was accurate and gone on to have a mediocre career in the food service industry. Fortunately, he'd never had to find out however since Gai-sensei was there for him, and would always be there for him the way he was now, smiling and encouraging him as he worked his way to new heights despite the pain. In the hospital, Hinata winced at the pain she felt as she awoke. As she came to, she could feel something warm, fuzzy, and breathing under one of her hands. She was pretty sure that it was Akamaru, since she knew from experience that the dog had a pretty unique coat texture that was not quite coarse or soft. She had learned this when Kiba had allowed her to brush the dog on a few special occasions after they had become teammates. Considering how protective Kiba had been of Akamaru at the academy, that had been quite the sign of trust. When she opened her eyes, the light nearly blinded her. Eventually though, her eyes managed to adjust to the relatively dim hospital illumination. The first thing she noticed when she'd finally adapted to the light that she'd been without for so long while she had been unconscious was the bouquet on the nightstand. Apparently, someone had given her flowers. She had a difficult time trying to translate the meaning behind the bouquet until she realized that the flowers had been selected for color instead of meaning, since the predominant color was orange despite the rather unpleasant meanings of some of the flowers. The second thing she noticed was that the person she'd sensed was sitting by her bed wasn't Kiba as she'd expected since she was petting his dog, it was her father. After realizing that her father was sitting at her bedside, she briefly wondered what he was doing there, before realizing that it was more than likely because he wanted to chastise her for being weak and failing to defeat Neji Nisan once again. I'm sorry father, she said once she found her voice. She knew that the apology wasn't enough though. It would never be enough, just as she would never be good enough no matter how hard she tried because she would always fail. There is nothing to apologize for Hinata, her father said, before patting her on the head in a way she vaguely remembered from when she was very little, and leaving the room. Had that really happened? It couldn't have, could it? She must still be dreaming. It must be the result of the pain medication that was undoubtedly in the IV that was connected to her arm. There was no way hell that her father would have let her go without a lecture on every last one of her failings as a Hyuga, and as his daughter. Chapter 37, The Big Day Arrives. What did you just say? Zabuza asked, hoping to God that he'd misheard his wife. This couldn't be happening. Not yet. It was way too soon. They'd only just gotten married a little more than a month ago for heaven's sake. I'm pregnant, May repeated. He hadn't misheard his wife as he'd been desperately hoping he had done. He was going to be a father, despite the fact that he wasn't ready and would never be ready. He wasn't cut out for this kind of life. He had been made for a life of action and adventure, not changing diapers. He didn't even know how to change diapers, since he'd never gotten a babysitting job during the 4D ranks he'd taken as a genin before they'd handed him Cs because nobody wanted to trust him with anything that didn't involve killing. He honestly wasn't ready to face the fact that in 8 months or so, he'd be responsible for a small thing that screamed, wet and crapped itself, and he didn't think that he ever would be. Haku on the other hand was standing there grinning like an idiot, apparently happy at this turn of events. Well, it wasn't Haku. That was going to be the parent, and it wasn't Haku who was going to be responsible for the care and feeding of the impending bundle of doom. After the wedding, Mei had made it quite clear what she would do to him if he tried to foist all of the childcare duties off onto his loyal follower. Congratulations Zabuza-sama, Haku said much too cheerfully for his tastes. That settled it. He was going to find a wife for Haku, a wife that was willing to have lots and lots of babies, and they'd see who had the last laugh then. Sasuke was somewhat surprised when he woke up to find the sun already in the sky. Usually, Kakashi would wake him up at some insanely early hour for more of the training from hell. As he looked at the already risen sun, he wondered at the feeling that today was important somehow, but for the life of him, he couldn't think of why. It was as he was counting the number of days that he'd trained with Kakashi that he realized what it was. Today was the day of the third phase of the Chunin exams, and if they didn't get a move on, they'd be late. When the realization had finally sunk in, he shot out of his sleeping bag as if it were filled with flaming scorpions, raced out of the tent as if the very hounds of hell were on his heels, and went searching for Kakashi. There was no way in hell he was going to show up 3 hours late for something as important as the final phase of the Chunin exams. After searching for several minutes, he finally found Kakashi lounging in a tree reading one of his ever-present pornographic novels. "We've got to get out of here now or we'll be late," he yelled up to the man, relieved that he hadn't disappeared altogether as he was occasionally wont to do. "Late for what?" Kakashi asked lazily, not even bothering to look up from his book. "Late for the Chunin exams," he replied. "Whoops. Looks like I picked the wrong day to finally give you a day off," Kakashi said as he closed his book and dropped from the tree after tallying something up on his fingers. He couldn't tell if the man was being serious or not since Kakashi had a really twisted sense of humor, and it was sometimes rather hard to tell whether or not the man was joking. Deciding not to bother wasting any more time trying to determine whether or not Kakashi had actually been serious, he dashed over to the campsite wondering if they had time to pack their supplies. In the end, he decided to do so anyways, since there was no point in leaving stuff out where just about anybody could take it. More than one ninja had scored free supplies, due to the carelessness of others in the past. He knew this for a fact since he'd seen that boy scrounging for kunai and other unattended weapons on the practice fields when he was running low. As there wasn't really any time, he decided to sacrifice neatness for speed, and haphazardly threw everything within reach into his bag. In his office in the administration complex, the Hokage side as a final guest arrived as he was preparing to depart to the local arena that was going to be home to the third phase of the Chunin exams. Scheduling for the event had initially been a nightmare, as he'd had to work with the game's schedule for Konoha's ninjutsu team which had an important match scheduled for today, as the playing season schedule had been drawn up well before the lots had been drawn up for the locations of this year's exams. In the end, he'd been forced to give VIP seating and free snacks to the Konoha Tigers who were in charge of the arena when it was not in use for the exams, in order to get them to forfeit today's match against the Fire Country Lions who had also had to be given VIP seating for the event. Competitive ninjutsu was a popular sport in the elemental countries, with each country fielding at least one team and each ninja village fielding a team of their own as well. Most members of the professional teams were retired shinobi, but trained civilians who had either failed the academy or learned from relatives who had gone on to become ninja could be found on the teams as well, as there were rules against active-duty ninja competing in such tournaments. Competitive ninjutsu was pretty much what its name suggested, ninjutsu against ninjutsu, and the best ninjutsu wins. Points were also given and taken for evasive ability and creative use of terrain or lack thereof. Bouts were either singles or team trials and could last for several hours at a stretch. Some of the flashier moves first seen in the arena had found their way onto the battlefield on occasion over the years, such as the Uchiha's Grand Fireball Jutsu, which had previously merely been a jutsu that had been used to mark a certain rite of passage before it had been popularized by a top professional player from that clan sometime around the founding of the village. He'd been torn from his musings on competitive ninjutsu that he'd been lost in as he'd grabbed his hat and got up to go in order to be on time for the opening ceremonies when Danzo had walked into his office with some last-minute paperwork. Great. Just what he'd needed to start his day. Danzo, since the intelligence department seems to be your home away from home, maybe you could shed some light on why rumors about an Osuigakure which is supposedly located beneath Konoha have been making their way around the academy, he said mildly as he signed a supply requisition form that had requested a couple hundred more kunai than the unit that was officially under Danzo's command would need in a year. Village hidden in the sewage. Danzo replied as he took the form back. Other than the fact that children tend to come up with the most unusual things, I don't know. In the quarters that were set aside for visiting dignitaries, Orochimaru sighed as he arranged the cage's robes once more. He didn't quite feel comfortable wearing the things, and understood why the brat who had taken the position that should rightfully have been his had ditched them in favor of a jacket. Honestly, they reminded him of the time he'd gone around in a dress after losing a bet to Jiraiya, whom he was firmly convinced had cheated somehow. The fact that he was wearing his usual attire under the robes made things worse, as it was the hottest part of August, and this year was no exception. He was dreading setting foot outside. While the cage box at the arena would be both shaded and air-conditioned thanks to a number of near-invisible seals, the route to the arena and future battlefield where he would be fighting his former sensei was not. Normally, this wouldn't be too much trouble for him since he was acclimated to Konoha's weather, having spent most of the first 40 years of his life here, but today he was wearing far more layers than usual. In addition to his normal attire that consisted of underclothing, some armor, and his usual summer battle wear, he was wearing a long robe and an overcoat. He would have been overwarm in all this during the winter, but as it was summer, it was going to be a rather hellish walk. Bracing himself, he stepped out of the special quarters that had been reserved for visiting cage and into what had to be a furnace, if the sudden blast of hot air that hit him as soon as he was out the door was any indication. He wondered how he was going to keep from sweating and giving himself away by doing so, since this would be nothing for the real cage as Suna was worse, much worse. At the other end of the village from the much too warmly bundled Orochimaru, Naruto sighed as he made his way to the arena. All he'd heard in the streets was speculation about the performances Sasuke and Neji were going to give today, in hopes for a Sasuke-Neji fight during the final round. Those who hadn't been able to score an arena seat would be able to watch the final phase of the exams on a screen that had been set up outside, and would be able to catch the events in full or special highlights of the coming events at the local theater for the next month or so. There was an almost palpable air of excitement in the village, as Konoha had not scored the more desirable and better attended summer slot in a good long time. While winters in Konoha were relatively mild, many of the lords who attended the final phase of the exams did not enjoy traveling during that season, as a sizable number of them had to make their way over treacherous snowy passes and whatnot to even get to Fire Country. The excited air eased his tense mood somewhat, especially after his old team had dropped by to wish him luck that morning, and inform him that they'd be in the stands rooting for him. They'd had no doubts whatsoever that he could pass, and he had few doubts that he would pass as well. He'd gotten this far, and all he had to do now was kick everyone else's ass, starting with that bastard Neji. He just hoped he wouldn't look like an ass to the audience, and later generations who would be seeing his performance while doing so. The white-haired pervert Jiraiya had shown him the film of his own performance during the exam finals before he vanished to wherever the hell he went when he wasn't teaching him summoning or trying to convince him to let some of that damn fox out, and he hadn't laughed that hard in a long time. That wasn't exactly how he wanted himself to be remembered though. He wanted future generations to see how cool their Hokage had been as a kid when they studied him in history, not laugh at how stupid their Hokage had looked while fighting. At Ichiraku Ramen, Gaara hastily drained his bowl as he prepared to leave for the arena in which the third phase of the exams would be taking place. This was quite possibly the last time he would see the old man who ran the ramen stand and his daughter. He'd tried to order for them to be kidnapped prior to the invasion, but Baki had countermanded his order, and Baki would of course be paying for that after this bothersome invasion was over. While it was still possible that the old man would be taken and brought to Suna after the invasion was over and they and their allies won, there was still the distinct possibility that the small family would die before that could happen. He'd been on the edge all week, and suffering from withdrawal since he'd not been allowed to kill anyone for the past month, and these little visits to Ichiraku had helped him center himself, and hold on until the time was right and he could unleash the demon he contained, whether it be Biju or an evil monk as his people had believed it to be. When he attempted to pay his tab after he'd finished his ramen that day, the old man told him that the bull was on the house since he was a friend of Naruto, before he wished him luck in the exams. The man had given him free food. The man had given him free food, and not in a, "Here, now please don't kill me," manner. That had never happened to him before. As he made his way to the arena, he tried to figure out what he felt about it. He knew that hadn't felt this since his uncle had passed, and didn't have a name for it. Whatever it was called, it wasn't entirely painful. In a different section of Konoha, Shikamaru sighed and muttered troublesome as he and his father made their way to the arena. Personally, he'd much rather be at home, but he knew that he'd never hear the end of it if he skipped this. And that would of course be more troublesome than just showing up, giving up, and getting it over with since he'd be hearing it from his usually rather laid-back father as well. His father, who was following his mother's orders and making sure he arrived, was nursing a hangover because the man had gone out with his old teammates and gotten completely smashed the night before. When he'd gone to pick the man up from the restaurant, it had been while his father had been in the middle of sharing one of the more embarrassing stories of the original Ino Shika Cho team with another one of his friends. While learning new things was almost always interesting, he had not wanted to know that when his father and his teammates were genin, people kept mistaking Yamanaka-san for a girl since the usual makeup of a genin team was 2 males to 1 female, and that the man had been pursued by a particularly stubborn older genin for more than 3 months before he had finally snapped and dropped his trousers in a rather crowded public area. This morning had gone well enough though, making up for the embarrassment of the evening before. Both Ino and Choji had stopped by to wish him luck. Not that he really needed it though. He was still debating on exactly when he planned on giving up. In another part of Konoha, Lee's heart pounded in excitement as he raced towards the arena and his future. Gai-sensei was keeping pace alongside him as he ran. This was it. This was the big one. This was the day he'd prove himself to everyone. There would be no more hot-blooded loser. There would be Rock Lee, Chunin of Konoha and the next Green Beast. In the quarters that had been the Suna team's home for the last month and change, Kankuro slung Karasu across his back. His heart hammered in his chest as he prepared to depart. Today was the day. Finally, after months of planning, and a tense month of waiting and hoping that Gaara didn't snap and either kill him or find some other way ruin everything, it had come. Looking at Tamari, he could see that his older sister looked just as nervous as he felt. She knew too. Today was the day, and it was too late to go back. Today, they would go to war. Chapter 38, Naruto vs. Neji. Naruto's heart pounded as he looked up at the crowd that was seated far above him. It seemed to take an eternity before his match was announced and everyone else in line was dismissed and sent to wait in the competitors' box until their matches were called. Finally, after what seemed like forever, and yet no time at all, he was facing Hyuga Neji and waiting for the proctor to start the fight. A few heartbeats later, Shiranui Genma called for them to begin. The instant after the match had officially started, he summoned a few shadow clones before darting towards the trees in order to set traps that would take advantage of the terrain, leaving a pair of clones behind to test the Hyuga's reflexes and alter his traps accordingly. He was holding the toads he'd learned to summon in reserve, as they would make an effective hidden wildcard if he were backed into a corner since few people knew he'd signed the contract. The pervert Jiraiya had been convinced that he would have been able to summon the boss Gamabunta if he'd just used the Kyuubi's power during the summoning lessons, but he had refused since the potential consequences were too great. There was no way he was going to let any more of that fox out of the seal. Who knew what would happen if he did, or whether it weakened the seal every time he did so. Though he was unable to summon Gamabunta, and would likely be unable to do so for a good long while, he was however able to summon some rather large toads which he could use as a distraction if he needed to without resorting to taking more of the Kyuubi's unfiltered chakra. As he'd known going into the fight, Neji was strong and fast, and leading him into his traps would be like herding cats, especially considering the fact that the Byakugan had a near-perfect 360-degree view. In order to do so, he would have to wear him down until he was too worn out to use the Byakugan while avoiding him completely, which was pretty much what he'd figured he'd have to do considering the information he'd gathered on the Hyuga. Even with his amazing reserves and stamina, it was going to be tough, because he would have to make sure he didn't get hit. If he got hit by any of Neji's Juken strikes, it would be very bad for him because, if his chakra got cut off, there was little he would be able to do despite his amazing chakra reserves. If his chakra were cut off by the Hyuga's gentle fist, he would be forced to depend on his traps, which would only work if the other boy became careless. Keeping this in mind, he summoned and sent in a few more clones to soften the other boy up a bit more as he shifted elsewhere outside of his opponent's range, watching the clones in hopes of finding Neji's blind spot. Faced with the near overwhelming numbers his Kage Bunshin had provided, Neji went into some sort of spin, emitting chakra as he did so, and sent the clones and the weapons they threw flying in all directions. Whatever this was, it hadn't been in his information on the Hyuga. In order to end this fight, he would have to probe it for weaknesses. Anyone who knew Hyuga Hiyashi would have realized that his expression of mild surprise at the sight of Neji doing the Kaden was tantamount to an expression of stupefied shock on anyone else. The Kaden had been passed down the line of the main branch from parent to child in secret for generations. Neither of his daughters were yet ready to learn the Kaden, and yet Neji had somehow managed to reverse engineer and teach himself the technique after watching him. He'd known his brother's son was a genius, but he hadn't known that he was on that level. It was only natural really, considering the fact that Hisashi had been better than him at just about everything. It had only been a cruel trick of fate that had made him head of and therefore responsible for the well-being of the clan, and his brother who would have been the better leader, a member of the branch house. In the arena below, the spectators who were reasonably safe behind barriers that would prevent stray jutsu from wreaking havoc by accidentally killing a number of VIPs. Naruto evaded Neji, who had barely avoided the trap that he had herded the boy towards as he eluded him in hopes of gaining more information on the odd and seemingly impenetrable technique that the older boy was employing. So far, that odd spinning technique didn't have any holes that he could find, and he and his clones had attacked it from all angles he could think of. The only upside to his practically wasted efforts so far though was that Neji was wearing out just that much faster each time he used the technique. Perhaps if he used a jutsu rather than a physical attack. After the thought finally hit, he started preparing a wind jutsu while the Hyuga boy was still distracted and he had the opportunity to do so. He knew that he could have done this jutsu, or any other for that matter, when Neji hadn't been spinning around like a top, but he had been curious to find out if the unusual defense that his opponent was using was truly impregnable. Such knowledge would be useful to both him and the Hyuga clan in the future, as if he could find and exploit such a weakness, if any, then someone else could, and that could cost a Hyuga, quite likely this one, their life in the future. Fuden, Kazakiri no jutsu, he called out after making the requisite hand seals for the attack. He wasn't quite proficient enough with the jutsu that he could drop the name as he did the attack, as the jutsu's name was a focus of sorts, kinda like an extra hand seal. After enough practice, he could start dropping a number of seals, and eventually the name of the attack itself. Eventually, he would be able to master it to the point that he would be able to call it up with little more than a thought, but that was years, and possibly even decades down the line. As soon as the final seal had been made and the attack called, the resulting blade of wind flew towards the whirling Neji and parted as it met his chakra shield. Seeing as that hadn't worked, he would have to think of something else. Perhaps if he created a counter spin. His twister shot wasn't all that good, as he hadn't had much opportunity to practice it, but it probably would work for his current purposes. Upon deciding on a course of action, he did the requisite hand seals and blew out a small tornado of wind-laced chakra that spun in the opposite direction of Neji's whatever the hell it was. Both techniques collided, wind blew in all directions, nearly knocking him over as it ripped up plants around him, and a massive cloud of dust formed. When the dust cleared, Neji was on his ass with a rather stunned look on his face. Apparently, the counter spin had negated Neji's rotation as it had been meant to do. Neji quickly recovered, got up, and made his way towards him, looking almost completely uninjured and as stoic as usual despite the fact that he'd been picked up and dropped by a miniature tornado. Despite the fact that Neji appeared to be in near-perfect health, the attack apparently wasn't a total failure, as it had illustrated a weakness in the boy's technique, and softened him up a bit. Now that the boy had stopped spinning, it was time to send in the clones to soften him up even further. Since the boy obviously had a temper, if his behavior at the end of his match with Hinata during the preliminaries was any indication, a bit of battle banter might be in order to make him lash out and make a critical mistake. The boy was close to one of his better and more vicious non-lethal traps, if he could just push him into it. You know how you were going off on Hinata for being a failure, and how it was her fate to lose. One of the clones who'd apparently been thinking along the same lines as he had been said. Well, look who fate decided was the loser now. Not only am I going to win, I'm going to kick your ass for what you did to Hinata. Nobody hurts my friends, much less tries to kill one of them in front of me. I swear, there has to be something seriously wrong with you if you're willing to pull an Itachi in public. Many civilians, especially those from outside the village, might have been puzzled by the last, but he knew that Neji knew full well what he was saying and therefore would be extremely offended by the accusation, since in the years since the Uchiha massacre, pulling an Itachi had become slang for killing members of one's own family. Rather than reacting in a manner that would be expected of a ninja who'd just basically been called a clan killer to his face and trying to rip either his head or his balls or both off, Neji responded to this by going into a long lecture about fate, which included a story about why he hated his cousin so much. Throughout the lecture, that included a listing of exactly why Hinata was supposedly a total loser and anyone whom she befriended couldn't be that much better, especially a clanless orphan, he carefully nudged the boy towards the trap he'd been hoping to get the other boy to charge into in a mindless fury. Since Neji seemed so preoccupied with his tail, it seemed that his little plan would succeed despite the rather unusual setback. "Man, you're a total asshole," he said when Neji had finished his story, which included a bit of show and tell involving a seal. "What gives you the right to decide who is and isn't a loser and tell people that fate decreed it to be so? What gives you the right to decide what someone's fate is? You're not a deity, you're just some jerk who isn't even willing to admit that the reason he went after his cousin was simply for revenge." That apparently finally did the trick, and an enraged Neji finally lunged forward to attack. Good, if he could get him more towards the right, and keep him distracted while doing so. Now for the kicker. Hinata wasn't the failure, you are, he said, goading his opponent even closer to the trap he'd set up. Hinata worked hard to change herself, and wouldn't stay down even after she was defeated. You, on the other hand, you don't even try to change things or yourself, and go crying about fate when things don't go your way. I'm willing to bet that after this match is over, you're going to go on and on about how it was your fate to lose to a stronger opponent while plotting to take me out the moment you were given the opportunity to legally do so in revenge. You're pathetic. Bingo. There went Neji, there went the trap, and he didn't even have to pull out any of his toads to win. Pity. He'd been looking forward to seeing the expression on that guy's face when he summoned a toad the size of his bedroom. Oh well, he could always summon one later, and if that jerk tried anything, he'd be getting a close and personal view of the interior of a toad's digestive tract. How does it feel to be beat by someone everyone used to call a loser? He asked the boy, who was barely conscious and unable to rise, having practically been electrocuted by the trap he'd lured him into. 2.5 years ago, just about everyone would call me a loser and believed that I wouldn't amount to much if anything. I graduated the academy by the skin of my teeth, and was only barely competent when I did so. I spent the next couple of years building myself up practically from scratch with the help of Tetsuo-sensei, and now, well. Watch who you call a loser jerk. People do change, and chances are that the guy you constantly put down will end up kicking your ass in the end. Winner. Uzumaki Naruto, the proctor said, when Neji finally lost consciousness. Hyuga Hiyashi watched as his twin son was carried off by medics. Hizashi had always been the better of the two of them. It had been Hizashi who had almost always won their sparring matches. It had been Hizashi who had produced a son. It had been Hizashi's child who had proven to be quite possibly the most powerful Hyuga in generations. Hizashi, who'd been marked as inferior due to the timing of his rather unfortunate birth. He had failed his brother's son the way he always ended up failing the rest of his family, especially Hizashi. He hadn't known until it was far too late to do anything about it that the boy had harbored such hatred and resentment within him. He hadn't gotten close enough to notice, as looking at the boy was painful, since he was the spitting image of his father. The boy was a strong echo of the mirror image that had always been there until one day it wasn't, and he was forced to live in a world without Hisashi, because of his own ill-conceived actions. It was long past time that he should have a serious talk with the boy. When he did so, he would finally hand over a letter he should have given him long ago, but had selfishly held onto because it had been the last thing Hisashi had given him before he died. From his seat in the competitor's box, Lee felt a pang of jealousy as Neji was carried off the arena floor after having lost to someone named Uzumaki Naruto that he vaguely remembered hearing about on occasion. That should have been his victory. Neji should have won so he could face him in front of everyone in the next round, and prove that a genius of hard work could defeat a natural genius. He had trained so hard for the day he could finally defeat Neji. Today, however, apparently wasn't that day. He would still be able to prove that a person could be a great shinobi with taijutsu alone on this day, however. He was up next, and slated to face off against one of the Sand Genin, a puppeteer named Konkuro. In order to win this match, he would have to fight both his opponent and the puppet, which undoubtedly had any number of hidden surprises. Since his match would be starting momentarily, he made his way down to the arena floor as the Uzumaki boy made his way back up. He would fight him one day and see which of them proved superior. If what the boy had said in the arena was true, the Uzumaki was quite possibly a genius of hard work like himself, and because of that, that would be a fight he could look forward to. Finally, after the arena had been cleared, he stood facing his opponent, or possibly his opponent's puppet, as the two had been known to switch out in front of the proctor. "You got here because you got lucky. It won't take much to defeat you," his opponent said as they stood waiting for the match to start. The instant the proctor had announced the start of the match, he raced forward towards his opponent. He was going to make that Tsunanin eat his words. He knew that such thoughts were decidedly unyouthful, but he wasn't really in a good enough mood to care at the moment, and he would apologize to Gai-sensei and make up for this lapse later. Now, however, he was going to win. Elsewhere, Neji woke up to the sight of a plain white ceiling and the general fuzziness of painkillers. He could still feel the pain from the injuries that had been inflicted by that trap he'd stumbled into. Being forcefully pinned in place before being slightly roasted and electrocuted wasn't fun. Right now, he felt like he had an all-over sunburn, which, as any fair-skinned being who has made the mistake of living in sunny climes could tell you, was excruciating torture despite the fact that it had not yet reached the truly painful stage. Thank God someone had come up with the idea of fire-proofing shampoos and conditioners, otherwise his hair would have been worse than lightly singed, which would have been a disaster considering the number of years he'd spent growing it out so it would be just like his father's. He hadn't missed the winces his uncle and his grandfather tried to hide whenever they encountered him, especially after he'd started tying his hair back like dear old dad used to. When he got out of here, he would make the Uzumaki pay. He would. Damn it. The little bastard had been right. The instant the match was over, he'd started plotting revenge. Chapter 39, 3 more matches. Sakura honestly hadn't known what to expect from the boy who had almost handed Sasuke his ass in the academy hallway before the start of the exams over a month ago. As the boy had been older, in a completely different cycle, and not someone she encountered elsewhere in the village or from a family she was familiar with, she hadn't really known him from Adam. When she had questioned the boy's former classmates in order to gain information on him in order to form a strategy for dealing with him if she somehow managed to win enough times to face him, and vice versa, the word that had come up most often was, loser. She wasn't quite sure how accurate that assessment was considering. The boy's appearance and manner may have been overbright and disturbing to her sensibilities, but still, he had made it this far, and it couldn't have entirely been on the merit of his teammates, or strongest teammate rather. Hyuga Neji was last year's Rookie of the Year, and a seemingly insurmountable obstacle that she had been unable to come up with a plan for, which was just as well considering the fact that Naruto had already beaten him. Lee's opponent Konkuro was an unknown variable in this bout as well. She knew that the boy used puppets, but that was all she really knew about him, as there had been nobody to gain intelligence on him from. Should she find herself facing him, if through some miracle she'd passed that far, she'd find herself winning it. Unfortunately, improvising strategy on the fly with little to no information going in was not one of her strong suits. The fight opened with Rock Lee immediately charging at his opponent, which was generally considered to be a dumb move, but had actually worked for the boy, quite likely due to the element of surprise. The blow that sent the other boy flying also revealed that it had been the puppet rather than the person who had stood facing Lee at the beginning of the match. Either that, or the Konkuro boy was a master of the kawarimi to the point that it was both seal-less, and unaccompanied by the chakra, smoke, that was usually present during such elementary techniques, much like Kakashi. Lee seemed to be somewhat confused as to who to go after at that point since he had two dangerous and potentially deadly options, but decided to continue going after the puppet, apparently since if he followed that plan, he'd pretty much only be facing the puppet rather than both the puppet and his opponent. After several attacks that nearly destroyed the puppet, there was a strange clicking noise that came from within the wooden construct as it changed shape, rearranging itself into a different form that revealed a wide array of weapon launchers. One of the launchers started releasing a shower of senbon that may have been poisoned, considering the fact that it was a common practice in Suna. Lee was fast, barely fast enough to dodge. All it would take would be one hit however. "Lee, take them off." Guy's voice boomed over the roar of the crowd. Following that cryptic bit of advice, Lee disengaged from his opponent and shot for the shelter of the trees that ringed the arena, and started tugging on one of his leg warmers the instant he reached them. After hopping on one leg for a couple of seconds, the boy was obscured by some bushes, but after a loud thud, two loud thuds rather, a green blur shot back into the arena at an almost insanely high speed. Whatever it had been that Lee had been wearing, had apparently slowed him down considerably. Instead of going after the puppet this time, Lee went after the one controlling it. Due to the spandex-clad boy's prodigious speed, the boy from Suna didn't have the time to evade before a barrage of blows rained down on him courtesy of one Rock Lee. The puppet flew to his aid, but wasn't very effective in doing so, because Konkuro went down thanks to a rather precise and very powerful kick to the head which had been delivered shortly after Lee had dodged another volley of senbon and had returned in the instant before the puppet could fire again. As the proctor announced Rock Lee's victory, she found herself amazed at how strong the boy was, and lamenting the fact that he didn't look better. In the very short time she had known Lee, he had treated her better than Sasuke had over all the years she had known him. It was better to not think about that though. She was going to be Mrs. Uchiha. There was no way in hell that she'd lose to Ino in anything. She'd beaten the girl in battle, and she would beat the girl in romance as well. The fact that Sasuke had not yet arrived was worrisome to her. If he missed his match, he would forfeit. Fortunately, he and Gaara were last, so there was still a little time for him to get here. In another part of Konoha, Sasuke frantically sprinted through the streets while Kakashi followed behind him at a more sedate pace. He probably would have been at the arena on time if Kakashi hadn't picked a training area that was so far from the village. Since he wasn't paying as much attention to where he was going as he should have been, he tripped over a garbage can that had been blocking the alley he'd decided to use as a shortcut, hoping to get to the arena in time for his match at the very least. The instant he and the metal container collided, the contents of the can went flying everywhere, and an instant later, he landed in them. "That's what happens when you rush things," Kakashi said lazily as he helped him pick some bits of orange peel off his clothes. "I wouldn't have needed to rush things if you had woke me up on time." He snapped at the man as he slapped his hand away. As far as he was concerned, this was all Kakashi's fault. He stood up on his own, refusing all of the Hitaki's offers of aid, and started running again, cursing as he stepped into a puddle of God knows what that had been lying in the middle of the street he turned onto. Based on the smell, it couldn't have entirely been mud. In the medical wing of the arena, Neji looked down at the letter his uncle had given him. He had immediately recognized the handwriting on it from the notes his father used to leave behind for him before he went on missions. The scroll on which the letter he held had been written was well worn and appeared to have been opened often. Noting this, he remembered the slightly reluctant manner in which his uncle had handed it over, almost as if he hadn't wanted to give it to him despite the fact that he was the one it had been addressed to. Reading the letter, he learned that his father had defied his fate the only way he could at that point. He had chosen the reason for his death, rather than allow anyone else to choose it for him. His father hadn't died for the sake of protecting the main house from the trouble that had been caused by his brother's egregious blunder as he'd believed for so long. He had died for the sake of Konoha, his brother, and the rest of his family, and went knowing that his brother had been willing to die rather than sacrifice him. Instead of honoring his father's sacrifice as he should have been doing, he had hated the very people his father had died to save, and had savagely attacked the girl he'd once admired the most for being one of the sweetest and kindest people he'd ever known. He'd attacked the girl he'd once been happy to protect, not just because she was of the main house, but because she had been his friend as well. After his father's death, he'd spurned the love that Hinata had held for him as a member of her family, and done everything he could to hurt her. Despite all of this, however, she still kept trying to reach out to him. Naruto was right. He was a pathetic asshole. If Naruto was right about that, then there was a chance that he could be right about the possibility of him being able to change. He would have to test it and see who was right about that in the end. Shikamaru sighed. He just had to be given the worst opponent out of all of them. To tell the truth, he honestly hadn't even wanted to show up in the first place, since he'd planned on giving up, but knew that he'd never hear the end of it if he skipped, and that would be more bothersome than simply turning up and getting it over with. He had run a variety of scenarios through his head over the last month and had come to the conclusion that with the Aburame, it would end in a double knockout at best, since he didn't want to outright kill the boy over a simple competition, especially since there would be numerous opportunities for promotion down the line. The reason he found this match to be so troublesome was because the other boy's swarm was a near-perfect counter to his Kajimane technique. He could possibly get a fatal, or in this case winning, blow in before Shino's swarm took him out, but that would render him unable to compete in the next round, which would more than likely be against the Suna girl Tamari. Better Shino than him in that situation, as far as he was concerned. Defeating Tamari would be tricky and time-consuming, and he didn't want to go through the trouble of doing so. When the proctor called out that it was his turn, he opened his mouth to say he gave up, only to find himself being picked up by two of his fellow competitors and thrown into the arena. "I'm sorry about this, but Ino paid me, and it would be dishonorable not to fulfill my end of the bargain." Rock Lee called down. "You got paid." Uzumaki Naruto, Rock Lee's partner in crime, said. "Great. If he quit now, he'd have to go through the work of getting back into the contestants' box for nothing. Since he was already here, he may as well go ahead and get it over with." The fight started, and went pretty much how he figured it would go. He quickly caught Shino with his Kajimane jutsu, and Shino quickly caught him with his swarm of Kikaichu. Once that was over with, he quit before he was drained too much by the creatures. Now that that was over, he could rest until this bothersome tournament was over, and it was time to go home. Well, look who finally showed up," one of the two guards at the entrance to the arena said. "It's a good thing too, since I think there would be a riot if you were disqualified before your match took place, since many people have traveled a long way to see the last Uchiha fight. You're up next since the battle between the Haruno girl and that girl from Suna just started," the other guard said as he waved the last Uchiha and his sensei inside with a hand which held a portable radio on which an announcer's voice could be heard. Sasuke groaned as he swiftly made his way to the competitor's box, since he knew that he'd have absolutely no time to prepare for his upcoming fight. No matter how much Sakura had improved, the Suna girl would swiftly beat her, and since that was the case, there was no time to shower and change in order to get rid of the scent of the trash he'd landed in, or whatever the heck had been in the puddle he'd splashed through on the way here. Fortunately, his clothes were of a dark enough color and in a good enough condition that he'd look okay from a distance. When he reached the balcony that overlooked the arena, it had been in time to see a slightly battered-looking Sakura bat a fan out of the Suna Wind Mistress hand and launch herself into a pitched battle, apparently trying to negate the other girl's advantage by engaging in close-quarters fighting. While a somewhat brilliant strategy, it was obvious that Sakura was going to lose, and lose she did, but she put up one hell of a fight as she did so, making the older and stronger girl pay dearly for her victory. The pink-haired girl that had followed him everywhere begging for attention fought like a cornered animal. Along with the standard academy taijutsu and a style she'd picked up from that boy's former teammate, the girl had apparently learned several dirty tricks. Throwing dirt into an opponent's eyes was probably the oldest trick in the book, but it was highly effective when it succeeded. It failed in this instance, however, as the Suna girl had been able to dodge, apparently taught from infancy how to avoid such attacks, since she lived in the middle of a desert near an area that was almost nothing but sand. That wasn't the only dirty trick in the Haruno girl's arsenal. and it was apparent that Sakura had gotten her nails sharpened the last time she'd gone in for a manicure, if the scratches she gave the other girl were any indication. After watching the fight for a while, he could see that the reason Sakura had gotten so many blows in while not taking nearly the amount of damage she should have was because the girl was using a very subtle genjutsu that shifted her opponent's perspective slightly. Blows that would normally have hit vital areas were just a little bit off, and there were a few near misses where there should have been hits. The other girl had not yet discovered the genjutsu by the time he'd realized it was in place, and therefore hadn't started to compensate for it. The Haruno's choice of genjutsu was a rather good one, because something more obvious would have immediately been spotted and dispelled. This one however gave Sakura a slight edge since it was far more difficult to notice, especially when one is focused on fending off one's opponent. Sakura had rather clearly improved over the last month or so, but she was still annoying however. After putting on a surprisingly good show, Sakura eventually lost, as it had been obvious she would do from the start. Her opponent had been trained in both close quarter and ranged combat, and had been older, larger, and had a few years more experience. Amazingly enough, it had come close a couple of times, and Sakura had been able to hold her own for a while, damaging her opponent severely at one point, but she still lost. When the fight was over, the crowds cheered as the medics carried Sakura out of the arena and towards the infirmary. It was now his turn. He jumped into the arena, ignoring the comments of, "What the hell did Sasuke roll around in?" And, he could have stopped to shower at the very least if he was going to show up as late as he did, from the other competitors. As soon as he was in the arena, he stood in front of the proctor waiting as his opponent took the long way around, going down the stairs instead of over the railing. It was finally time. After a hellish month of hard work, he would finally show everyone the true might of the Uchiha. Chapter 40. Wave and Water Interlude. Hoshigaki Kisame was having a very good day. Earlier that morning, he and Itachi had managed to score a free tent. This had been an especially good bonus because their last tent had become more patches than tent over the last few years, and the Akatsuki didn't have a budget for camping supplies, thanks to Kakuzu's penny-pinching ways. They had just gotten off one of the money missions they occasionally had to take to fund the Akatsuki's other activities, and were headed back to aim with the pay. To make the day even better, Itachi had managed to scrounge up a radio from somewhere, which was excellent, considering the fact that today, the Konoha Tigers would be facing off against the Fire Country Lions in the Konoha Arena. Competitive ninjutsu was always good for a laugh, and since there weren't any particularly pressing matters, he and Itachi could sit for a couple hours chilling and listening to the game. Today was a particularly good day for such things, since the sun was shining, there was a light breeze coming in off the ocean from the east, and he'd managed to get his hands on a case of beer recently, which he had stuck in the nearby stream to cool. Finally, after a few minutes of fiddling with the radio, it was on Fire Country International. Regret to inform you that the game between the Tigers and the Lions won't be taking place today. Our loyal listeners will be getting a special treat instead, as the reason for the cancellation was due to the third phase of the Chunin exams. Change it, he said. He wasn't exactly in the mood to hear about a bunch of genin inexpertly wailing on each other in hopes of becoming Chunin. The first match will be Hyuga Neji vs. Uzumaki Naruto, both of Konoha. The second match will be Konkuro of Suna vs. Rock Lee of Konoha. The third match will be Aburame Shino vs. Nara Shikamaru, both of Konoha. The fourth match will be Tamari of Suna vs. Haruno Sakura of Konoha. The fifth match will be Gaara of Suna vs. Uchiha Sasuke of Konoha. No, I think I'll leave it here for a while, Itachi said, pulling back the hand that had been very slowly reaching for the radio's tuning knob, as the boy had apparently been listening for any familiar names before he flipped the station in search of something better, or at the very least more interesting. 100 Ryo says that the Kyuubi Jinchuriki wins the first match, he said. No bet, Itachi replied. In the main town of Wave Country, which was the closest thing the small country had to a city, Inari sat in front of the old radio in the inn twitching in excitement as he waited for the first match of the exams to start. He and his grandpa, who did carpentry work as well as heavy construction, had dropped by to fix one of the walls that had been destroyed a few days earlier during a fight between a pair of genin from Kurigakure who had been escorting an exceedingly fat merchant. A few minutes earlier, someone had turned on the game between the Lions and the Tigers, and instead got a surprise announcement. Naruto would be competing in a tournament, and best of all, he was up first. He was up against some guy named Neji, but he was sure Naruto would win very quickly since he was the most awesome ninja ever. As soon as the announcement of the reason for the cancellation of the Lions and Tigers match had been made, several people rushed out of the inn to get everyone they could find. There was no way in hell anyone was going to miss this. As we wait for Proctor Shiranui Genma to announce the start of the first match, a message is coming in over the radio network from the former Whirlpool Citizens Alliance in the nation of Wave, wishing Uzumaki Naruto luck, and that everyone there will be rooting for him. For those who don't know, the Uzumaki were a prominent clan in the former ninja village of Uzushiogakure, which had once been Konoha's closest ally. Inari grinned as he listened to the message. He knew exactly who sent it, since there was currently only one certified radio operator in Wave, and he was a jack of all trades, including bridge building. In Kurigakure, Haku turned on the radio, hoping to distract his Zabuza-sama from his anxiety over the impending arrival of his child or possibly even children. Zabuza hadn't been doing so well since Mei had made her announcement, and had had a minor panic attack when he'd brought up the possibility of twins, since there was a history of that occurring in Mei-sama's family. A nice game would be exactly what Zabuza-sama needed to get his mind off things, and there usually could be one found at this hour on just about any station that wasn't devoted to music. Even the religious stations ran commentary on sports of various kinds. The Jushinist's commentary on the River Country soccer tournament that he'd tuned into last year had probably been the most disturbing thing he'd ever heard. With the goal of finding a nice relaxing game in mind, he casually flipped through the stations until Hoppy the Frog and Friends has been cancelled in favor of the third phase of the Chunin exams, which are taking place in Konoha this year. While we normally don't air Chunin exams in which Kurigakure ninja aren't competing, we thought people might be interested since Uzumaki Naruto, who fought Momochi Zabuza one-on-one and survived as one of the genin competing. We now go live to Konoha. And that's the signal. The first round of the third phase of the Chunin exams has officially started, and it looks like Uzumaki Naruto is making the first move of the fight. What move will he make, and how will Hyuga Neji, who is favored to win, counter it? He hoped that Zabuza-sama wouldn't order him to turn the radio off. It sounded like it would be an interesting fight, though he disagreed with the announcer from Konoha on his assessment of Naruto's chances of victory. Naruto would be winning, of course, not the Hyuga he'd never heard of. In a popular Kiri Shinobi bar, Mizuko and Kenpachi nearly spit their drinks out when they heard what was on the radio instead of the Tigers vs. Lions game, which the bartender usually played since he was a big Lions fan, despite the fact that such things could be marginally considered to be traitorous. Has formed a number of Kage Bunshin which have scattered. Several have moved to engage the Hyuga. What is it, Kenpachi? One of the other patrons asked. The Kyubi Jinchuriki is competing in the exams. Kenpachi replied. The one who ripped up those two Iwa genin a year and a half ago during the winter exams. The concerned bar patron asked. Yeah, Mizuko replied, after finishing his drink in record time. I figured he would have been promoted long before now myself, but apparently not. That Neji boy is going to be creamed. Mizuko's fellow drinking companion said. Creamed. Kenpachi said. He'll be eviscerated. 100,000 Ryo says the Uzumaki wins it all. Mizuko said, slamming the money down on the counter. You're on. Kenpachi said as he pulled the same number of bills out of his wallet and slammed them down next to Mizuko's money. The pair of Iwa Chunin groaned when they returned to camp. They had been hired to escort a merchant to Wave Country, which had recently reopened trade with the rest of the world after the collapse of Gato Corp, and had decided to hang around for a day or so to enjoy the nice if somewhat humid coastal weather before they trudged back home, which would be roasting hot right about now. They had decided to use some of their precious free time go fishing, and had set out early that morning, forgetting rule number 1, which had made something of a comeback in recent years in the process. It seemed that they weren't the only ninja in the country, as someone had expertly bypassed and disabled all their traps before making off with anything and everything they considered useful, including Kuarutsu's toothbrush. Seeing as they needed those supplies, it looked like they would be spending their afternoon tromping around the island looking for the thief or thieves rather than relaxing as they'd hoped to do, and that was most definitely not how they had wanted to spend their day. Things would certainly be getting even worse by nightfall, as when they finally found their missing supplies, they would have to fight to get them back, and one or both of them would probably be nursing injuries on the way home depending on the skill of their opponents. Grumbling about the indignity of it all, they set out in search of their missing property. After about half an hour, they found themselves at a camp near a stream that contained a very familiar tent. Is over. Uzumaki Naruto expertly led Hyuga Neji into a trap which simultaneously burned and electrocuted him that the experts say they have not seen in decades. As our panel of experts are retired shinobi with more than a century and a half of experience combined between them, this is saying something. We will now go to the head of our expert panel, Council Member Udatane Kaharu, for a more detailed explanation. Hey! Kuwarutsu yelled as he approached the camp that was occupied by some soon-to-be-dead ninja. That's yes, a voice said as a head poked around the tent. A very familiar head, with a face that he and his companion had last seen in a bingo book, amongst the S-class entries. That's a neat tent. Kuwarutsu continued, swallowing down the diatribe he'd had planned and putting the kibosh on the ass-kicking that would obviously not be happening unless it was his ass that was being kicked. There was no way in hell he was going to be getting himself killed over some measly camping supplies. Me and my friend here lost ours. Do you know where we could get another one? There's a camp about 2 miles in that direction that seems to be unattended. Hoshigaki Kisami's camping buddy, who was also another familiar face from amongst the bingo book's S-class entries, said as he pointed in the opposite direction from their camp. Gee, thanks, Kuwarutsu said. We'll just be going now. With that, they both fled. Hopefully, they'd be a little luckier at the next camp over. The unofficial shinobi supply rule number 1 stated that any supplies left unattended were fair game. In another section of Wave Country, Sato and Ichiro walked back to their camp. They were so close, yet so far, as the place they really wanted to be was about a day's travel away. They had wanted to be part of the coming action today, but had been forced to remain behind and take missions so things would look like business as usual, and Konoha wouldn't become suspicious until it was far too late and soon as forces were breaking down their gates with their new allies. Part of business as usual included lingering for a day or so if they could swing it, as ninja weren't usually eager to hurry home to the extreme weather that would be waiting for them in the hottest parts of summer or coldest parts of winter, unless there was someone practically riding their asses. If they had tried to swing by Konoha sometime today, it was possible that they would have arrived at the wrong time and aroused suspicions, ruining months of careful planning and obsessively rehearsed synchronized movements of which they hadn't been a part. They would be able to hear Suna and Oto's grand victory as it happened though, as Sato had thought to bring a radio with him. It's gone. Sato called out from the tent. What's gone? Ichiro asked. The radio and about half of our supplies. Sato called back. Fucking Iowa bastards. Ichiro snarled as he kicked a tree. He'd spotted a pair of Iowa Chunin casually fishing off the new bridge when he and his partner had gone into town for breakfast that morning. It was at that point that said, Iowa bastards, attempted to sneak up on their camp. They managed to overpower the pair after a struggle. Give back our radio. Sato snarled at his captive. We don't have it. One of the Iowa nin said. We don't think you'll want to try getting it back either. The other Iowa nin said as he struggled against Ichiro's grip. And why not? Ichiro asked. If those bastards had done something to the radio, they were dead. Same reason we didn't try taking our tent back, the first Iowa nin replied. Hoshigaki Kisame and Uchiha Itachi have it. Bullshit, Sato said as he punched his captive. You don't believe us. Come look for yourselves. Sato's captive replied. Though they didn't know exactly how, Ichiro and Sato found themselves sparing the lives of and dragging their captives 2 miles to a campsite that was set in a rather nice clearing next to a stream. Seated in front of a tent that looked like it had recently come from the Iowa supply warehouse next to the missing radio were a pair of men in black cloaks with red clouds on them. A pair of exceedingly familiar men with black cloaks with red clouds on them. Ichiro and Sato moved to dispel what had to be a genjutsu and found the men still sitting there listening to their radio. The black-haired one turned to look at them. Quiet, he said. My brother's up next.